If you'd always planned to go postal in this election, you might well be actually feeling that way now if your promised ballot papers haven't arrived. In one last controversy before election day, perhaps, the government is urgently investigating delays in the delivery of forms up and down the UK. In Scotland, where schools are already out and people on holiday, it's causing uproar. At one address, however, 10 Downing Street, they'll be getting ready for a potential big change in Prime Minister. We'll find out what goes on behind the scenes and what to make of the row over Keir Starmer's plan to still spend time with his family after 6 p.m. on a Friday, even in Downing Street, if he's there. Welcome to Talking Politics, the election. Hello and welcome to Talking Politics. Whether you're watching or listening, Robert and Anushka are with me as ever. And we're also joined today by ITV News election analyst Professor Colin Rallings. We are honoured with the visitation so close to the big day. Let's turn first to the reported delays to the postal votes. I mean, it's being reported this could affect thousands of them. They're now simply part of the way we go to the polls now, Colin, aren't they? Just talk us through a bit of this.
They are, Julie. Many years ago, you had to apply for special permission to have a postal vote. You had to be away on holiday, which had to be certified by somebody, or you had to have a medical reason, and everyone was expected to go to their local polling station. As one of the Blair government reforms, and the Conservatives at the time said this was a bit of electoral gerrymandering by Labour, postal voting was made free access to anybody. And from that, several local authorities made really big efforts to increase their postal electorate. They thought that, I think it would save them money. They thought it would be a way of accessing the election for some people who were perhaps less interested. And so by now, in places like Sunderland and Newcastle, and not always in sort of safe Labour areas like that, Rushcliffe and Nottinghamshire too, a huge proportion, by which I mean 40% and above of the electorate has a postal vote, because they've been encouraged to by the local authority and by the local parties. In London, on the other hand, postal voting is still actually quite small, both because people would say it's pretty accessible to get to the polling station in London, but also I think, again, the local authorities haven't bothered too much about it. So it's made it more of an issue. And it's an issue, yes, if people haven't received their postal votes, but it's also become an issue, I think, in terms of if there was a late-breaking development in the election that was a real game changer. People who have a postal vote, I have a postal vote myself. I voted 2 or so weeks ago. Now, if something had happened in the last 2 weeks that made me really think that I'd voted inappropriately, wanted to change my vote, there's nothing I could do about it.
Has that happened?
Well, to me, no, it hasn't happened to me. But you, of course, Anushka won't remember, Robert may vaguely remember. Harold Wilson, famously in 1970...
I don't remember.
No.
I thought
right, you see, there you are. Blamed, first of all, England losing a World Cup football match to Germany for his demise at that election. But more seriously, there was an importation of 2 what were then very new and very fancy jumbo jets, which had an impact on the balance of payments situation for that month. That was then represented in the Conservative papers as what a shocking job Harold Wilson and the Labour government is doing, and that had an impact on the election. And if the vast number of people who have postal votes now had them then, they wouldn't have been able to react to those developments, pro or con. So it's quite interesting, and I think the parties must, and Robert and Anushka will know more about this than I do, I think the parties adjust their campaigns to that. They know when the postal votes go out. They know when they have to get the people to get the postal votes in. So it's almost a two-headed campaign now. Yeah. Campaign to get the postal votes in, and then you campaign for the vote on the day.
The week that most of them were supposed to land, but obviously we know lots of them haven't, but the week that they were, I mean, I remember someone messaging me from one of the parties saying they literally couldn't believe that the other party wasn't putting out more attack ads that week, because to them, that week was as important as polling day.
But it was quite striking that Rishi Sunak's one policy aimed specifically at retired people came out, and they made a song and dance about, as postal votes were, arriving in the homes of people who applied for them, and we know disproportionately older people tend to have postal votes, and that policy was all about protecting the real value of the amount you can earn before you pay tax if you are retired, how much you get in pension and other savings returns. So the postal votes, definitely matter to parties. They're also, the other thing which is very striking to me is I've been talking to candidates who, there are always leaks. I don't quite know how this happens, but there are always leaks of what the postal votes are showing in particular constituencies. People, see the piles of votes arriving, and in certain constituencies, as Colin was saying, postal votes are more important than in others. And so I'm not going to name the constituency, but a really panicked Conservative candidate was telling me about that. He basically thought he'd lost in a particular constituency because of what he'd been told about the postal votes, and he just said, it's my voters who are voting, even if it's not the whole electorate. I don't see how I can make it up on the day.
Yeah. You get. Even if you don't have a very high postal vote electorate in your constituency, you get an indication of direction of travel. Yeah. Because what happens is that postal votes are opened before the election, because when you have a postal vote, you have to put your signature there and you have to put your date of birth, and that gets checked and electronically, I think it is. But if you don't, if you don't hit the button, your vote gets rejected. And then the postal votes are open, because otherwise it'd be a long process on the night, and the parties send in scrutineers. And they're not allowed to see the match-up between the names and the votes, obviously, and they're not allowed to know the detail of what's going on. But as Robert rightly says, just as in the ballot box, as we will see on Thursday night, the piles pile up.
I am fascinated by you saying that the Tories accuse Labour of gerrymandering with postal votes, because I always had the impression that postal votes favoured the Conservatives.
Well, they did, in the sense when it was older people.
But do we know now how it spreads?
No, because what Labour thought they'd benefit from, and there were quite a few sort of minor electoral changes at the fringes in the first few years of the Blair government back at the end of the 90s to help them along this road. What they thought was that it was an easier way of getting hold of people who couldn't otherwise be bothered to vote. They were on the school run, or they were offered an extra shift and things. It's like many of these changes. It's probably made only a minor difference. It's a bit like the voting ID.
That voter ID, I was going to say.
It's a bit like the voter ID thing. The voter ID thing is the Labour accusing the Tories of gerrymandering it for their advantage. But the reality is that voter ID only affected a relatively few people. And most of those then would come back again with the relevant ID.
Or people like me who always lose their ID.
Yeah, or people like Boris Johnson, and what a surprise that was. Or was that a classic Boris Johnson trick?
And what do you think? I mean, but just in practice, I mean, obviously, if you want to vote and you can't, it's incredibly personally frustrating, and you've been deprived of a very important right. I mean, one is anxious, though, given that this is an election in which we know that very small margins of difference will determine the outcome.
Well, that's where I was going to pick up next.
The interesting question to me is, if it turns out that the numbers of people deprived of votes are really quite significant in some areas, and they turn out to be areas where, 100 votes either way would have made a difference. Yeah. I mean, that's potentially quite worrying.
Yeah. And that's why, presumably, a lot of the uproar about this is in Scotland particularly, and it all goes back to when the election got called, because we know that Scottish schools have already broken up for the summer, their families on holiday, and it's unsurprising, therefore, we've got certain figures in Scotland raising this very specifically. And we know there are plenty of tight seats there where presumably it could make a difference.
Exactly. But the problem is with these things in the British system is, what do you do about it? There are ways in which you can raise electoral petitions if you think the candidate's offended or something like that, but I'm not sure with people.
We haven't got a sort of hanging chads process, have we? Taking us back to that notorious presidential election.
And again, it's difficult exactly to point the finger, because some people may have not received their postal votes because they live in houses of multiple occupation, and somebody's stolen or just taken it away, and so it's no longer there.
It's very interesting, because the Royal Mail have been very quick out of the traps to say it's not us. We've checked our system. It's not us causing the delays. And I suppose, again, it is that factor of it being a snap election where all of these local authorities have got to get their acts together incredibly quickly, get all of this out. People have got to apply for them in time. they need to have put in by June the 19th.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, there is a sort of massive sort of logistical programme that has to be done alongside all the normal.
But something else we're talking about, the electoral administration, which I suppose I'm a bit more interested than most normal people are.
Do you think?
But that's one of the other reforms that has been introduced recently. We now at least have 5+ weeks before an election. You used to be able to call an election in 3 weeks. Yeah. So when Ted Heath called his winter of discontent election, and it wasn't but the miners' strike at this election in February 1974, we had 3 weeks.
Yeah, but
boom.
On that,
God, I wish we had 3 weeks.
well,
For different reasons.
Just feels like 10 years.
some Tories were saying to me, Rishi could have gone for a shorter period, but just slightly shorter, and they wondered if that would have been better.
Only mildly shorter. It has to be 5 weeks plus. I tell you who went for a slightly longer period was that Theresa May made the last crazy election announcement on Easter Tuesday.
Wasn't that 2 months or something?
Basically, Easter Tuesday in April for an 8th of June election or something like that. So nearly 2 months.
That felt...
It felt a little calmer here, I have to say, than the last 5 weeks have done. But
It was long, but Labour said they wanted longer.
Didn't John Major in 97 have a very long campaign period?
97, he went to the wire.
Yeah, we went right to the end, but then...
So we all knew... Yeah, so we
all knew it was
coming. Had to come on that day, end of story, really,
But I can't remember how long the actual campaign... I thought the campaign was quite long.
No, I can't remember, but I mean...
Or maybe it was because he went to the wire, it just felt like it went on for months.
We knew that and as, I heard you say earlier today, Sunak could have gone to January, and if he'd got, come the autumn... We'll never know, but come the autumn, and I think it's probably what we're all expecting, we thought we were going to have a 2 months, 3 months even election campaign, but, plus and minuses, but there we go.
OK, well, we'll see where this goes. It's worth saying that the Electoral Commission are advising anyone who hasn't got their postal ballot pack to request a replacement from their local authority, and you can actually submit them on the day if you take it to your...
You can indeed. Until
really? How do you do that? You just take it down to the voting station?
You can hand-deliver the voting pack to the voting station, and your electoral services in your local council apparently will give you all the guidance.
But you've actually got to go, haven't you? You actually physically got to go to the bloody...
And it defeats the object. It's no good if you're sitting in Mallorca.
I was going to say, if you've gone from Glasgow to Mallorca on holiday, it doesn't do you much good. And it might also delay the count in some, because they have to be all opened and looked at. And sorry.
Anyway, let's talk a bit more about those few days after polling day. If the polls are to believe, the Starmer family might soon need to set up a forwarding address of their own for postal deliveries. It's the most iconic address in the country. So as the removals vans roll into Downing Street, what goes on behind the scenes to prepare for the changing of the guard? And this is one of those sort of supremely fascinating facets of our system, that this change of power happens literally within hours. And you get all this drama in Downing Street and all this massive sort of effort, civil service-wise, to do this handover. It is a sort of fascinating sort of snapshot in our own way of doing things, isn't it?
But are you interested in the sublime or the ridiculous?
Both.
Because we get both.
At this stage, both.
I mean, because one of the things that is quite interesting is quite how intensively civil servants are working. They are expecting, it may turn out to be wrong, but they are expecting a Labour government, and there frankly hadn't been a lot of preparation done because people, assumed, as we've just been talking about, that the election would be in the autumn. And so the officials I'm talking to are literally working around the clock, trying to understand Labour's manifesto, trying to work out what advice to give to, if there are a new set of ministers, what kind of advice to give to them. So they're extraordinarily detailed preparation going on in that sense. And then there's just all the stuff which I'm always marvel at, actually, having watched it, is just how they get all their stuff out quite so quickly. And then when you turn up, I mean, it's the sort of, you get sometimes first-hand reports, but quite often second-hand reports about the state the previous incumbent left the place in.
It's like an Airbnb.
It's not unlike an Airbnb review, as you say, and usually not very flattering. But
did Boris Johnson get 5 stars? I wonder.
There were reports of dents in the desk where Gordon Brown has slammed his mobile phone down. All that sort of stuff. I love all of that detail, and I suppose I'm sort of got personal interest because I'm doing day 2 after you guys have been up all night. So this will be slightly unfolding in the more formal way on our screens in front of us. But that formal handover, the speeches, whether you walk up Downing Street with your family or not. If it is to be Keir Starmer, it's that moment when you walk into the room, presumably with the monarch. to be asked whether you will go and form the next government. I mean, this is real high drama, isn't it? And then behind the scenes, meanwhile, at Downing Street, you've got this massive scurry to just get stuff ready.
But also, they don't know, and some of them are quite superstitious about what happens. You know, in 2015, I think everyone on the Labour team was told what jobs they would have inside Downing Street, only to find out by the end of today that there would be no jobs inside Downing Street. So even with the polls where they are speaking to people, there's still a bit of nervousness. There's still not the clarity of exactly who'll be working on what. Although if Keir Starmer wins, he has to go to a NATO summit on Tuesday. So some of them must already know. And if you speak to any shadow cabinet member, they have been having those access talks during this campaign. I mean, that has been ongoing to try to work out what they do straight away.
But there is a limit, frankly, to what they can do given the time available. The other thing, which, you know, is the stuff of, you know, sort of thrillers and spy novels is...
Your thriller?
It might be in the third instalment of the thriller series. Currently plotting, but anyway, it is when you sit down as Prime Minister with the security services and you get that briefing, which even if, as a Privy Councillor, as leader of the opposition, you get some security information, I'm told that when they really go through the list of the threats that this country faces, it's quite a moment. And don't forget, you know, we are still a nuclear power, and you know,
those letters
and they
of
have to
last
write,
resort have to be written.
He has to write the letters about what to do. You know, if there is a you know, he has to give, you know, to you know, the various people in the submarines who've got the nuclear weapons and what to do in certain circumstances if we're under attack. I mean, one shouldn't underestimate being head of government. It's quite a weighty burden.
Yeah, it is indeed. And this at maximum, well, let's face it, maximum vulnerability on the world stage as well, because if it is going to be Keir Starmer and his new administration, there will be world leaders watching, thinking, right, this is potentially a moment for the United Kingdom. They've got a very exhausted new team who've just been through this six-week campaign. It can feel a little sort of, you know, vulnerable in some ways, I suppose, from some people's perspectives. There's that moment. And it is just the fact that people will be sort of knackered when they get there.
Absolutely exhausted. It's like the most exhausting thing they've ever done, followed by the next most exhausting thing they have ever done. And actually, it's interesting because he's a human rights lawyer, and when you think about his history and the stuff he's done, people I speak to who have gone into government always seem to shift to the right on human rights matters, and they always claim it's because of all the stuff you see behind the scenes and all the stuff you're not allowed to do and all the kind of protections for people. It'd be very interesting to see whether that instinct for Keir Starmer from his past, from his human rights legal past, actually comes to the fore if he becomes Prime Minister. I mean, I mentioned NATO. The other thing that would happen really quickly, if he is Prime Minister, and if Rishi Sunak is still there, would happen for him too, is the UK is hosting the European Political Summit, which I think there's 50 European leaders who are going to be at Blenheim Palace. It will be a huge moment, not just in terms of the kind of world stage of it, but also, are we going to reset our relationship somewhat with the EU? That might be a moment to start laying things like that out, all while he's got this huge kind of plan to change planning reforms, etc.
I mean, I'm just going to say on the human level, having spent a bit of time with him yesterday, I was quite struck actually at how well he currently looks. I think one shouldn't underestimate that when you know the election is coming, actually the not knowing when is pretty exhausting. He is the kind of person, and he constantly says this, said it again to me yesterday, that he is one of those people, he kept saying, I go forward, I don't look back, I go forward, we're going forward. And he sort of constantly repeats this thing, but actually he's lost weight. He told me, I asked him, I said, how do you sleep? He says, I sleep incredibly well. So I think weirdly, you know, it is a big burden, but it may, you know, actually office may suit his personality.
The other thing we should note, actually, given that you've just mentioned the Blenheim Palace summit and NATO too, is the other thing that happens, of course, on day one is the calls coming in from world leaders and the protocol about, you know, the sort of ranking that they get put through. It's all of that. You're suddenly trying to navigate the diplomacy as well. I mean, it is an absolute headbanger, isn't it?
And if you're doing our job, Anushka's and mine, what you spend your all time doing is saying, well, why hasn't Biden spoken to you? Is that an American snub?
Yeah.
So yes, there's a lot of stress and sort of hierarchical neurosis around all of this.
Yeah, and that's before you've got new MPs being sworn in the following week. I mean, the whole machine, everything
And a
is in full
cabinet to
turn.
make. I mean,
Cabinet
obviously,
to make,
we know
exactly.
there are the odd cabinet member shadow cabinet member, I should say, who are in seats that, some of the odd seats that might be tricky for Labour. So that will have to happen straight away. I can't see them changing any significant positions, given how much the access talks have been ongoing. But that will be very interesting.
Although it is if you say that, but if you are, in the shadow cabinet, there is a pretty because in the end, right, and lots of prime ministers have said this to me. They say, the moment that you are at your most powerful is when you're appointing your first cabinet, because it really is a personal decision. Now, we sort of think that he's simply going to appoint most of the shadow cabinet to those ministerial jobs he may not win if he has that opportunity. But it's not 100% certain. And it'd be slightly surprising if there are, I don't know what you think, but I bet you there's been one or two surprises, one or two appointments we don't.
I think we've shown this before on Peston. They've got too many shadow ministers for the legal number they're allowed. I think there's something like 30 of them have to get sacked. It's going to be a bit of a Hunger Games. But he's probably not the very top.
More and more people seem to get invited to cabinet now. That's their sort of, as their SOP, attenders cabinet. And you want to.
But these are not. I'm not talking shadow cabinet here. I'm talking ministerial roles more generally.
But there is one that must surely be nailed on, and that is Rachel Reeves.
Can you imagine?
First female chancellor, and it's just really interesting reading some of them. I mean, there's so many profiles. You've interviewed her in depth and spent some time with her, Anushka. It was just really interesting, some of the stuff that in the papers in the last few days, and what difference will it make to have a female Chancellor of the Exchequer? What's your take on that?
I think it will make a difference in loads of ways, because if you speak to Rachel Reeves, in many ways, look, she has, I don't know if this is okay to say, but they've created, or she has come forward as this really authoritative figure, which is sometimes particularly hard for women in politics and particularly hard from the kind of conversations I have for women on the left in politics, because they're kind of more disruptive than women on the right, and sometimes they face more sexism, in my opinion, and sometimes all of us probably look at someone and we don't think they have the same authority as another person. And the way they've made Rachel Reeves really authoritative is to put her in amazing, smart suits and put her in city boardrooms and put her on the roof of things. So she's got that authority and she'll bring all of that with it. But if there's one thing I would say about Rachel Reeves, having known her since she first became an MP in 2010, is absolutely, in the same way as I, as a journalist, see things through the lens of who I am, a woman. She definitely does that, and she definitely emphasises certain areas which perhaps a man wouldn't as much. And, one day in a wonderful panacea in the future, men will say the same things. But, for example, there's going to be a big focus on childcare. Now, to be fair to the Conservatives, I think they'd actually taken us quite a long way on that childcare journey. But that is something that I know Rachel Reeves really cares about. And we will see things like that. But, I think she'll have as much authority if she wins as any male chancellor or more.
And just very quickly on the sort of gender point, obviously, like me, Keir Starmer is pale, male and stale.
You're not stale, Robert.
But
never stale, Robert.
But you arguably the three most powerful people under him, if they win, it's Rachel Reeves, it's Yvette Cooper, and it's Angela Rayner. And so this will be, actually, in terms of British governments, obviously we've had two female prime ministers, Tories, but nonetheless, I do think, certainly in those top jobs, we'll have more representation of powerful women than we've ever seen.
Black foreign secretary as well.
Yeah.
Indeed.
If they win.
OK, let's see. Not long to wait now. With only 2 days of campaigning remaining, it's perhaps unsurprising the political attacks have become frenzied and yet more personal. So when Sir Keir Starmer made a comment that he plans to continue to finish work at 6 p.m. on Fridays to spend time with his children, the response was swift. Mr Sunak accused him of planning to be a part-time Prime Minister, while another Tory minister spat that it's not just a daylight hours only job. Well, earlier today, our colleague Carl Dinnan asked Keir Starmer for his comeback to the criticism, and here is what he said.
This is just increasingly desperate stuff. I actually can hardly believe that 48 hours before an election, the Conservative Party has got nothing possible positive to say as they go into this. I've been arguing throughout this campaign, you'll have heard me many times saying they haven't changed, they're just the same, nothing's going to change. And they're proving it. Because they are not saying, look, if you vote Tory, vote Conservative on Thursday, these things will happen. They're just in this negative, desperate loop. And it is really desperate. My family is really important to me, as they will be to every single person watching this. And I just think it's increasing desperation, bordering on hysterical now.
So this was after Keir Starmer had done an interview on Virgin Radio with Chris Evans. I mean, if you needed any signals that were in the last couple of days, this is potentially it. What do you make of it, Colin?
Well, I thought it was all meant to be about work-life balance these days, whoever you are. So, I mean, I can remember, in my day job, I've had, vice chancellors who've come in and said that they're, going to treat this as a job and they'll almost clock in and clock out. And there are others who work all the hours God sends and they look exhausted and they don't necessarily do a better job. So I think it's individual people can make their decisions. And as long as they do the job, that's fine. And Keir Starmer, if you want to spend only Friday, he's not talking about going home at 6 o'clock every day. And there'll be plenty of people out there who think, well, I'm always going home at 6 o'clock every day and just try and stop me. That's not his approach.
And I think if there's an emergency on a Friday night, he'll be around for it. I mean, one of the things, and I've seen this going into Downing Street, including when I went in recently to Downing Street to see Rishi Sunak with his family, clearly really cares about his girls, clearly wants to spend time with them. It's actually quite a good place because you just have to pop downstairs and up and you can see your family. I don't believe for a second Rishi Sunak actually thinks that it's a bad thing if Keir Starmer wants to spend the evening with his kids when he can. And also, do you know what? I used to do a job share as political editor of The Guardian, and it was very unusual. And lots of people were like, how could you possibly do a job share for such a senior role? And I said, well, sometimes I wonder, how could you possibly not? Because otherwise it's a 7-day, 24-hour job.
That absolutely that really broke the mould, that move, didn't it? I remember that.
I went into number 11 Downing Street at the time and I spoke to the Chancellor at the time. I might not name names just in case, but you could possibly work it out. And I said to them, what about a Chancellor job share? And they said, but who would make the decisions? And I went, both of you would. You'd come to an agreement, or one of you's in charge at a different time. And I did wonder if that was a bit of a male-female imbalance.
But it's also the case that, well, really since Blair, the country's got used to the idea of having proper families in Downing Street. Yeah. And it's sort of mad, actually, that having got used to the idea of proper families in Downing Street, there's still sort of allegedly something weird about somebody who wants to be Prime Minister saying, I like spending time with my kids, it's really important to me, they're at vulnerable ages, they're doing exams and all the rest of it. I mean, the other thing is, inevitably, because this has been, in some ways, a ludicrously fractious campaign on some issues. I mean, I was quite, so Keir Starmer actually, in a long interview with my partner, Charlotte Edwards, talked about how his wife's Jewish heritage mattered to him. They're not practicing Jews, but they want their kids to be connected to the culture. And Friday nights actually are it's a Friday night dinner. So Lord Mann, who's the government's anti-Semitism advisor, said he just thinks it's really dodgy making a criticism of an individual who wants to just carve out a bit of time around, some Jewish ritual. But more than that, one of the things about Keir Starmer, some people say, he finds it hard to connect to people. But in some ways, he is one of the more normal political leaders we've had for quite a long time. He's going to have to... he's very honest about this. I've talked to him about it, as you have. But he's worried about two sacrifices. What about going to Downing Street? He really is worried about. One is both being able to spend proper time with his family and the invasion of their privacy. And then, and I completely empathise with this because we support the same football team, he's very worried about not being able to go to Arsenal. But I think that's completely normal. I think that's completely normal.
Yeah. But can I just say one thing the Conservatives are trying to say here is basically when he's not around, who else is around? And in particular, they're trying to criticise Angela Rayner as someone who might be around. And look, there's obviously a history where voters might see Angela Rayner as more to the left of Keir Starmer, and she has said some inopportune things in the past about Conservatives. But the one thing I do think is, speaking actually to a Tory strategist, they weren't sure that the Angela Rayner attacks were that sensible anymore, because they thought that now, if you look at the polling, she is a net positive for the Labour Party, including among people who might have traditionally voted Conservative.
Right. And I think also it just makes you, it's one of those touchstone moments. You think, well, what did the other Prime Minister do? And it's not just a question about having the family living above the shop. But, you know, David Cameron was famous for his chillaxing. Boris Johnson allegedly painted buses on boxes or something from one of the election interviews we got. I mean, goodness knows what else. But, you know, even if you're going back to Ted Heath, there was sailing, there's piano. You know, people were sort of, you know, I mean, people acknowledged that if you had a hinterland or a family or other stuff beyond the job, it was generally seen as being not a bad thing.
And Winston Churchill painted and downed a couple of bottles of champagne a day, so that was another way.
And I do think, and also the COVID, like what happened during COVID, where people were able to actually work from home more, where none of us had done that before, and there are certain jobs where it's harder and certain jobs where it's easier. It did improve work-life balance, and I do worry that there's, you know, that we don't have a spin back where we don't see the advantages of that, alongside, of course, making sure that productivity is high, etc.
And it's been surprising coming from Mr Sunak, because I think otherwise you'd have thought he'd already fitted into that pattern. This is Robert saying, family, Hindu faith, all these things are creating space around those.
I mean, after all, did he talk to you about loading the dishwasher? So plainly the domestic...
That was in a Grazia interview, I think.
It wasn't to you.
Yeah. We won't go into the blue jobs and the pink jobs.
And it was quite a bad interview. I mean, I think they were slightly cringing about what they said there, yeah.
But I suppose, just as a wrap-up thought, I mean, Robert, maybe to you, you know, I mean, if any sign were needed that we are nearly there, it's the fact that this is the stuff of chat, and it's everywhere, whichever, you know, podcast you listen to, whichever radio programme I've listened to this morning on the box, everybody's just talking about this, because it's just like, right, are we nearly there yet? Are we nearly there yet?
We are.
Well, we are nearly there, yeah, and, you know, I mean, you and I talked about this last night on News at 10. I mean, the truth is, for both parties now, it is about converting. You know, when they knock on doors, they send emails, people say, we're likely to vote for you. They're doing all that follow-up contact, trying to persuade those people to actually walk down to the polling station, put the cross in the box. I mean, there is, you know, uncertainty around any election. It's probably still a bit more uncertainty in some ways, in one key respect around this election than in some others, which is there are still quite a lot of people saying either they're not completely certain or they're not going to vote. Yeah. And quite a lot of pollsters don't really believe the thing that they're not going to vote. So we just, you know, for the parties, they just want as many people now to make up their blooming minds, but they're not going to change the message. This is now just about organisation and contact.
And we could actually have a very low turnout at this election. The last time turnout was below 60% was in 2001, when everyone expected Labour to win that election, and of course they did. Yeah. This time, many people out there think it's all over and they won't bother. And that's not a good look either.
Nearly there. OK, thank you all three as ever. That's all we have time for now. I'll be back tomorrow afternoon at 4 p.m. live here on ITVX. And don't forget that as soon as that exit poll drops after 10 p.m. on Thursday night, Tom and the team will kick off more than 12 hours of coverage. This lot will all be there. I'm coming on the next morning on ITV1 and ITVX. So do join us for all of that. But for now, from all of the team here, bye-bye.